Good evening. Welcome. Happy Fat Tuesday. Happy Shrove Tuesday. Thank you all for spending your Tuesday with us. I'm Joe Capizzi. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology. The Institute has been here for over 3 years now. Ross has been an important member of the Institute since our founding. He's been our media fellow, and he's helped coordinate some of our events, some of our more contentious events you may have seen Ross was involved in. Right. Right. Anyway, we're super pleased that Ross is joining us today on, I think, the day of the release of his latest book. All of you know Ross as one of the most important commentators on American culture today. He writes, of course, for the New York Times opinion page. He's written more than a few books at this point. They seem to all, or at least a couple of them, have the title "How We Became Something." Right? I know that. I know. Right. You might want to steer clear of that or explain that at some point. Anyway. Today, the format is going to be that I will engage Ross in a conversation about the book. I actually had the pleasure of reading it, and it really is an interesting book. It's, in my judgment, not the sort of typical, conservative harangue on the way things are, but it takes a nice tack to explore what's going on in our culture. Once he and I have exhausted each other, we will then open up the conversation to the rest of you. So there will be people here with microphones. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and they will approach you, and don't be alarmed. And then, make your question and Ross will engage you. And of course, as I always do, I implore you to to phrase a question to people. The more time Ross has to respond, the better for everybody. So don't make a speech if you can avoid that if possible. Just a nice pointed question, okay? Again, thank you all for coming. All right, so let's begin. The book is called The Decadent Society with Decadence. What is decadence in the book?
So this is working. First, thank you all so much for coming. Joe, thank you so much for doing this. It's really a pleasure to be back at CUA in a situation where I'm not moderating between the two embodiments of warring factions of modern American conservatism, as delightful as that was. But I've promised that midway through we'll have some sort of WrestleMania-style face-off and give people their money's worth. So decadence. So basically the book, the conceit around decadence is lifted from a definition offered about 20 years ago of the term by the great cultural critic Jacques Barzun, who wrote a book called From Dawn Till Decadence. And he basically made the argument that we should think of decadence not in terms of sort of just catastrophic moral corruption, not just in terms of luxury goods and weekends at Las Vegas, the perks in the faculty lounge here at CUA, that kind of outrageous stuff, but as a kind of clinical term that describes a civilization that has achieved a certain level of wealth, development, and proficiency, and finds itself, in effect, stuck without clear lines of advance, is his formal way of putting it. Stuck is the op-ed columnist's distillation. So in the book, my gloss on Barzun is to basically say that decadence, properly understood, refers to stagnation, drift, and repetition at a high level of civilizational development. And the argument then is that this term very reasonably applies to America, the West, the developed world, encompassing, I think, the Pacific Rim since the late 1960s, early 1970s, and for the sake of convenience, but also, I think, for the sake of what it evokes, I start the book with the moon landing as this kind of particular peak of American and Western achievement that was expected at the time to be not a peak, but a beginning, right? The opening of, in Kennedy's phrase, a new frontier. And instead, it very quickly turned out that our capacities were more limited than we hoped, and space a tiny bit bigger and colder and less remunerative, especially once there wasn't a Soviet threat to compete with. And so the space age sort of petered out, and that frontier was closed, and at that point, we really entered into what I'm describing as decadence.
You identified 4 areas of, 4 indicators almost, right, that support the claim that we're in a period of decadence. you just named a few of them, right? Repetition, stagnation, a kind of economic and technological stagnation, political sclerosis, I think, is one, and sterility. Do you want to just talk about just like identify one of those and exemplify it, as you do in the book for those who haven't read it?
Sure. So the easiest one to start with is political sclerosis. That's the one that I think everyone in the Western world, and especially in the U.S., recognizes and agrees upon, that over the last few generations, it's become a lot harder to effectively govern Western countries and to effectively reform or transform or build new or unbuild government programs. And so an age when it was possible to elect a president and have a dramatic program of reform from Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, really down through Ronald Reagan, has given way to an age when presidents are lucky if they can pass one major piece of legislation across their presidency. If they succeed, as Obama did with Obamacare, they may pay a political price for it that lasts the duration of their presidency. And overall, politics is dominated by various stalemates, by polarized parties competing with each other without building clear majorities, with, in the United States, sort of congressional abdication and an increasing form of government that consists of basically negotiation between the executive branch and the judicial branch, which I think is how a lot of actual American policy now gets made. But I think there's a version of this, a somewhat different version in Europe, where you have the institution of the European Union, which has advanced to a point where it is, in effect, too big to fail. It has all kinds of problems, but no one except, the wild and crazy English are willing to actually take the step of leaving. Even the sort of fearsome populists and nationalists of Eastern Europe don't actually plan to leave the EU. But meanwhile, it's inefficient. It creates the common currency, creates all kinds of economic problems that are obvious to everyone, but it can neither move forward nor back. It can't shrink back towards a more sensible arrangement. It can't move forward towards the kind of actual European superstate that many of its architects envision, and so it too is sort of has this stalemate. So that's what I'm describing as sclerosis, and as I said, I think it's sort of, that's the easy one, right? That's the one that people nod along to. The others are a little bit more debatable. So stagnation, economic stagnation, is not as sort of thoroughgoing a reality as sclerosis. You still do have periods of economic growth. We've managed a respectable pace of growth basically since the Great Recession in 2008. But overall, you do see a pattern of real deceleration, lower growth rates compared to what was the norm prior to the 1970s, and you have those growth rates achieved basically through a kind of perpetual borrowing, right, where you can get to 2% growth with massive deficits, whereas in the 1950s you could have 4.5% growth with what then were sometimes complained about as massive deficits, but weren't really deficits at all. So in effect, and I think those deficits may be more sustainable than some conservatives think, but they're sustainable as, in effect, it's a rich society paying itself to maintain a form of progress that its own fundamentals don't really justify.
Talk a little bit also then in stagnation about the technological stagnation. You refer in the book to Back to the Future, for instance, right? To exemplify this, just give us a walk through that.
So this is an argument that I'm basically stealing from a group of economists and non-economists who, over the last 10 years, have made the case that, in spite of the iPhone in your pocket and all the resources of the internet, technological progress since the Apollo era has been pretty disappointing. And so this is an argument that Tyler Cowen of George Mason has made. It's an argument that Peter Thiel very famously made with his line about how we expected flying cars, DeLoreans winging their way into the future, and instead we got 140 characters on Twitter, which is now 280 characters. So in fact, there is no great stagnation. And Robert Gordon, an economist at the University of Chicago, or at Northwestern, excuse me, who's written a sort of sweeping 1,000-page book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And the point they all make is that it's not that technological progress has ceased. Obviously, the internet era has demonstrated a lot of incredible breakthroughs in communication, information transmission, and simulation. It's more that technological progress has become monodimensional. It's all tech and nothing else. And areas like transportation, energy, agriculture, even the built environment don't see the kind of progress that we took for granted between 1840 and 1970, let's say. And then further, when tech companies sort of leave the world of tech and try to revolutionize real-world industries, those are the companies that often end up being the supposed unicorns that turn out to be frauds or failures. So, Theranos is the attempt to bring big tech to bear on a very old-fashioned, worth-solving problem of how do you conduct easy blood tests, but it doesn't work, right. And you end up with a multi-billion-dollar company evaporating, or WeWork trying to revolutionize office space, a similar story. So that's, I think, the core of that piece of the stagnationist puzzle is that, again, progress hasn't ceased, but it's progress along a very particular dimension that then feeds back into the larger pattern of decadence because it leads people to spend more and more time in virtual realities, in simulations of reality, and to retreat from, both certain kinds of economic activity, but also, to bring us to another force, retreat from family formation, romance, sex, childbearing, which is the aspect of decadence that I call sterility, basically.
Yeah, and there you have a wonderful comparison of Margaret Atwood and P.D. James's books on, both of which involve a kind of sterile landscape, which I thought was just really, really brilliant, really fun. But let's start to think a little bit critically about what you wrote. So what would count as counter indicators, according to you? So you're giving a kind of, right, you provide indicators, metrics by which to, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, yeah. Sorry, thank you, Michael. You provide indicators by which to identify us as a decadent society. What might count, though, as counter indicators? In other words, signs of life that you'd
Sure.
have to engage in your
So let's give examples, right? So one of the key indicators to suggest that we are not, in fact, living through a period of immense technological transformation is the fact that productivity growth, right, an economic measurement that tries to get at how technology is affecting the way people work, has been stagnant and kind of pathetic for a long period of time in the early 21st century. That was not true, however, in the late 1990s, in the initial flush of the internet revolution. There was, in fact, a surge of productivity growth in the developed world from, let's say, 1996 to 2001. And so that suggests, one, that I was alive then, I was a teenager, and it really was this sort of brief window where there was this sense of sort of the possibility of really dramatic growth returning. And had that continued, I think the argument I'm making today I would be making a different argument, right? That window was a non-decadent exception that then didn't have the cascading effects that people expected it to. Or another example, right? So I mentioned sterility, right? The defining feature of demography in the Western world since the baby boom, since the 1960s and 70s, is sub-replacement fertility. People having too few children to essentially replenish the population. And this is true everywhere. But for a long time, America was something of an exception. And so down to the early 2000s, American conservatives especially like to say, well, look, because America has retained a more dynamic economy than Western Europe, it's not, sort of as socialist and sclerotic, and it has retained a certain amount of optimism about the future and intense religious practice. That's why our birth rate is still above replacement. We're still a country sort of oriented towards the future in a way that France or Sweden or increasingly Japan are not. So in that sense, the United States was not decadent by my definition, as long as its birth rate was exceptional. But over the last 10 or 15 years, our birth rate has ceased to be exceptional, and we are now indistinguishable from sub-replacement fertility levels. So those are two examples of how it's not, under my attempts to create a statistical understanding of decadence, there are things that could happen and have happened that would be undecadent, and if they happened again, it would count as at least a shift, a change. But the other point I would make is that I'm not trying to examine each of these forces as sort of forces that are just existing on their own. The reason, every society has some decadence in it, right? What's distinctive about our moment, I think, is the way that these forces are converging, so that slow economic growth feeds political unhappiness and distrust in government, which makes it harder to pass effective political policy programs, which in turn slows economic growth further and then drives down birth rates because people don't have any, don't feel like they have the economic capacity to have kids, which in turn makes society older and more risk averse, which makes it harder to make political changes. Anyway, you follow me. But there's a sort of a convergence of these forces that makes our moment more decadent, not fully decadent, whatever that would mean, but more decadent than periods in the past that only had one of these forces at work.
Great. Talk to me about the we, right? How we became the victims of our success in this. Who is the we here? Because it is something I wondered, as I proceeded through the book, that at times it could be the United States, at times it could seem like it could be the West or something like that, and then at times it seemed almost global in terms of your description. But I wondered whether, aside from expanding it, out to include more and more, people who might be this we, who are the victims of a success that now is leading to decadence, it might be exclusive, the finer grained you go, and exclude certain communities who might say, no, we're not in an age of decadence, right? We're actually in an age of prosperity or ascendance, right? Think of African American community in the United States, right? They have, an African American president was recently elected. There's more and more representation and so on. Like, how inclusive is the we here? I guess is the point, and to what extent might thinking about that refine your analysis at all?
So I guess I'll work backwards, right? So take the case study of African Americans. I think, and this is, of course, a highly debatable proposition, but I think that there was more progress for African Americans in American life in the period running from 1940 to the moon landing, or 1940 to 1980, or pick a period like that, than there has been in the period since. And in that sense, I think African Americans have participated to some extent in decadence as I'm describing it. So, and this has varied a little, and African-American unemployment rates are particularly low at the current moment, and obviously the election of the first black president was a dramatic breakthrough. But if you look at gaps in racial wealth, household wealth, the black-white income gap, if you look at test score gaps, all of the things that sort of reformers who are interested in racial equality are interested in changing, you get a lot more change in a lot of those cases in in the era of the civil rights era in particular, but really the whole zone from the Great Migration through the King assassination into the 1970s. So in that sense, I think, at least in some socioeconomic way, there is a kind of participation in decadence there. And I think it's a little more of an open question in culture. Obviously, in certain ways, there's been a big increase in African-American representation in pop culture and in cinema, but I also think sometimes that too is overstated, and there's a little bit of forgetting of the very recent past. That if you go back to the 1980s, the biggest stars in America at that moment were African Americans. Now, one of them was Bill Cosby, which is not something that's sort of a cause for celebration at the moment. But Bill Cosby, Eddie Murphy, it was not the case that there was no African American representation, and the rise of the African American pop culture figure really dates to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and we're getting a sort of a further cycle now, but it's not a complete novelty. So that's the that's to the last point. In the larger sense, I mean, I think one of the questions the book raises and doesn't answer is this a Western developed world phenomenon, or is it a global phenomenon? And I think I feel very confident in arguing that there is some kind of deceleration and stagnation that Japan, South Korea, the United States, and Western Europe share in common. The harder question is, what is happening with the countries that we still call developing? What is happening with what we think of as the rising powers of the world, China, India, and so on? And you could make a case that the decadence of the West is what is going to enable the non-decadent developing world to develop in some sense past us, right? When we talk about a Pacific century or an Asian century, that's sort of implicit. At the same time, I think there are ways in which, you know, if you look at, for instance, if you look at demographics, right? If you look at the demographics of China, it's in the same low fertility trap that the developed world is in, and there are ways in which you could say China is converging with the West, right? That they're, you know, as our government decays a bit, there's a sort of convergence in oligarchy, right? As our, you know, our billionaires compete to be president, and it's not the same thing, obviously, as the Politburo in Beijing, but there's a sort of convergence in stratified low fertility oligarchy at higher rates of wealth than in the past that isn't a case of China leapfrogging past us. And obviously what's happening with the coronavirus raises a further host of questions that we can talk about in the apocalyptic portion of the evening.
Great. Yeah, I did have a question about that, but we can save that. Well, another thing that I enjoyed about your book was that it wasn't an end of book. It's a book that doesn't say we're in this decadent society and it's only a matter of time before it's over. It actually describes a kind of sustainable decadence.
That's the bumper sticker for the, yeah.
You should get shirts made with sustainable decadence on it. Yeah, so describe what would make this a sustainable decadence, and then of course it sort of leads into what wouldn't make it a sustainable decadence.
Right. So I mean, one of the claims the book makes is that people hear the word decadence and they have the idea that there's sort of an iron logic of history, that once you become decadent, you are doomed. And you know, the absolute cliche version of this is, you know, the writing on the wall of the Babylonian palace, or, you know, orgies in Rome while the barbarians were sweeping in, and so on. And in fact, I make the argument, I think it's true, that decadence is a very normal condition for successful societies and empires and civilizations to fall into. And once they do, it can lead to collapse if they have a rival who can exploit the decadence, but it can also lead to a kind of sustainable stasis that can last a very long time. And you know, it was, however you want to chart Roman decadence, it's 400 years from the Nero Caligula moment to the actual fall of Rome. However you want to chart Ottoman decadence or the decadence of the Chinese Empire down through the 18th, early 19th century, these are long historical periods where prosperous and powerful societies, in hindsight, look decadent without them being tipped over into crisis and collapse. And in certain ways, that is a more pessimistic vision for our future, in the sense that I think there's an appeal to the idea that once you're decadent, you're also doomed, right? There's a sense, at some level, people want history to follow a kind of morality play arc, even if they don't want to actually be caught up in the sacking of Rome themselves. And this is, I quote W.H. Auden at the start of the book saying something like, I'm going to mangle the quote. Actually, I don't have to mangle the quote. The book is right here. That is so convenient. So Auden says, he says, what fascinates and terrifies us about the Roman Empire is not that it finally went smash, but that it managed to last for 4 centuries without creativity, warmth, or hope. So that's the dark version of sustainable decadence. But let's qualify it by saying that, actually those 4 centuries that Rome lasted under decadence were, especially from the point of view of, the faith that founded this university, actually a period of dynamic change from within, as there was the sort of development of a very much non-decadent religious faith that did not, in the end, save the Roman Empire from ruin, but did preserve and carry forward Roman elements into the future, down to the present day, and was sort of there when the empire finally went smash as a powerful force in its own right. And I think you can imagine versions of that. You can imagine renewal under decadence that actually reinvigorates our civilization. You can imagine a renewal under decadence that, when our civilization falls, creates something new to carry on the best of our own legacy. And that's the optimistic case, right? That, you know, in fact, decadence has its virtues. There are alternatives to decadence that are a lot worse than the lives that we have now. And we should regard life under decadence not necessarily as sort of a horrible burden, but as something that's not ideal, but potentially a gift, because it still leaves room for creativity, renewal, and paths back to dynamism and flourishing.
Yeah, so paths back to dynamism and flourishing. I did not anticipate encountering Cardinal Sarah in the book, and I even less anticipated encountering Wakandan exceptionalism. So if you haven't read it, I apologize for spoiling. So Wakandan exceptionalism.
This is a no spoilers zone, man.
And Cardinal Sarah as possible ways of envisioning, I guess, or imagining some sort of replenishment. Do you want to just walk through
yeah. So my basic view is that if you're thinking about the vulnerabilities of a decadent civilization, the vulnerabilities of Europe are in certain ways starker than ours. And in part that's because Europe is more advanced on some of my sort of statistical decadence indicators. They've had lower birth rates for a longer period of time. They've had sort of relatively stagnant growth compared to us for a longer period of time. But they're also more vulnerable in the sense that Europe sort of sits in the middle of the world, whereas, you know, the United States has always had its splendid isolation. And Europe is in I think, a pretty deeply unstable equilibrium, not only, as people often think, with Islam in the Middle East, but also with the current exception to demographic decadence, which is the continent of Africa. And so we're headed for a scenario, basically, where Europe, which used to have more people than Africa, will potentially, by 2075 or so, have 500 million odd people, and Africa could have 3.5 billion. And one way or another, it doesn't seem like that kind of equilibrium will hold. And so you can tell a pessimistic story, one that I think a lot of conservative and reactionary types tend to tell, where, you know, Europe will try and build a fortress against mass migration, and then the fortress will fail, and there will be sort of migrant-driven chaos as far as the eye can see. But you can also tell an optimistic story, which is the ones that I was raising by referencing Roman Catholicism's most famous African cardinal, and the sort of the image of Wakanda and then Black Panther, the sort of Afrofuturism that has some sort of interesting appeal in the decadent West as examples, you know, less examples because they're not examples, they're more suggestions of what a more successful confrontation between Europe as it is and will become, and whatever Africa is going to become, could play out. So in that sense, that's an example of how the places where a decadent civilization can seem most vulnerable are also the places that, in the best timeline, offer the most hope for renewal. And Seurat, you know, I quote him going and giving a sermon about the martyrs of the Vendée, right? So it's this sort of fascinating example of a very conservative, traditionalist Roman Catholic cardinal from Africa talking at sort of a monument to the Catholic dead of the French Revolution, and in effect sort of trying to call Europe back to its ancestral faith while also building bridges to an increasingly Christian and reasonably Catholic Africa. And what comes of that, I don't know, but I think it's sort of an example of how history could present unexpected syntheses that you wouldn't have at all anticipated 30 or 40 years ago.
And on the subject then of unexpected stuff, because you seem to be, as you said, it's a reasonable argument to make that what we're seeing is a kind of long playing out over time, if anything, right? But you do also think through the apocalyptic. And today your column, right? Today you wrote a column that talks about the coronavirus as a kind of test case that you had not anticipated of the thesis in your book of a kind of...
I mean, I'd say I anticipated it. I didn't anticipate it happening while I was literally promoting the book. I figured we could have some sustainable decadence for the book tour, and then the Stephen King scenario could hit. But yeah, I mean, I think, look, I don't think the coronavirus is the thing that ends our decadence, but it's an example of how unexpected events, or not complete, I mean, this isn't completely unexpected, right? A global pathogen is in certain ways the most predictable thing on the list of potential world transformers. But, it's something that can hit the weak points in a decadent society, right? So, if the fact that under decadence, as I was saying, our government clearly doesn't work particularly well. The public clearly doesn't have a lot of trust in public institutions. You have had a certain amount of naivete in the way the Western world has exported part of its industrial base and become so dependent in its supply chains on China, a country that, in certain ways seems to be headed towards a more stable authoritarianism, but in certain ways could be vulnerable to totally unexpected turmoil, even revolution. So in that way, yeah, I mean, I would say, I would describe the coronavirus as a kind of stress test for decadence. And I do think it's, I think it's actually quite serious, and you should all have a week's worth of canned goods in your home, that too, so.
But how is it a stress test, though? It's a stress test because a decadent society will not be capable of responding to it in an adequate way, or it's a stress test?
Yeah, so, well, I think, I mean, again, I think we will be capable of responding to it in a imperfect but fundamentally adequate way. But I don't think it's guaranteed, and I think it puts pressure on precisely the institutions that under decadence are least functional and most vulnerable to outside stress, right? And so, I mean, what I said in the column, and I'll in certain ways repeat it here, right? So you have this effective stalemate in Western politics between, some sort of centrist establishment that believed really intensely in globalization and sort of the promise of the early 21st century, and that has, I think it's fair to say, misgoverned the Western world in various ways. And that misgovernment has conjured up this populist response, but the populist response seems perpetually unready to actually govern the country. And so the coronavirus, you could say, is a threat that on the one hand is not consciously, except in maybe some providential way, exploiting the mistakes of the establishment, right? The mistake of saying, oh, it's fine to have all of your supply chains go overseas. It's fine to not manufacture your own antibiotics domestically. We're not going to go to war with China and so on. It's picking out that, it's hitting that sort of naivete, but then it's also hitting the fact that the establishment isn't running the government, the populists are running the government, and that means we have an acting secretary, an acting Department of Homeland Security head whose testimony today instilled no confidence whatsoever, and Donald Trump, right? I mean, say what you will about Donald Trump, you would think that the populist who got elected talking about how we need to police our borders and be tough on China would be the man for this hour, but Trump's tweets have not, Trump, he seems convinced that he can sort of talk the markets into calm instead of, actually acting like a germophobic nationalist, which might be the thing that America needs right now.
Very good, very good. Well, but there's one of the four indicators does seem poised to respond to this, or at least I think most of us are anticipating, and that's technology, right? That I think we assume that the one area of technology that's going to be responsive to this will be medical technology. And so while we're not, exploring the stars with human beings in the way that we anticipated, all of us, I think, more or less take for granted that it'll probably by the summertime, there will be some kind of medical response to this, and if not the summertime, it'll be shortly after that, because that's what we expect of our technologies, right?
And I think that's reasonable and a counterpoint to some of the stagnationist argument, right? That it's not just that well, I would put it this way: I don't think we necessarily expect a incredibly effective public health response. I don't think we necessarily expect the sort of governmental side, but we do expect there to be at some point a vaccine. I think that is an expectation that we have, and that has been, we've effectively come closer. An Ebola vaccine. We have managed past threats like this one, not always with a vaccine, but even the last Great Plague, AIDS, was eventually not dealt with, but at least sort of responded to with some effectiveness. So I agree. There haven't been, one way to put it is, there haven't been the kind of incredibly dramatic medical breakthroughs that a prior round of breakthroughs led us to expect. So when Nixon declared war on cancer, there were reasons to expect that we would actually cure cancer, and instead we have very slowly made, some grinding progress against cancer. And the same goes for Alzheimer's, an array of chronic illnesses, and so on. We haven't had the big dramatic victory, but there has been some slow progress, and then there's been some specific progress on rarer conditions that is dramatic, and there's been, effective responses, somewhat effective responses to new diseases as they come up. And so in that sense, I agree that it's not full decadence, put it that way. If it were full decadence, we should not expect the vaccine, and I think we reasonably do.
Yeah, and there's a lot, I think, within the realm of technology and probably economic stagnation as well, where, like you said earlier, I think there is good argument to be had about what's happening, even the way in which I think your book assumes that a kind of technological progress measured in rapidity is a good, right? That not to have it becomes a kind of marker of decadence.
It's not always a good, right?
I hope not.
But it's right. But and I say in the book that there are ways that technological progress could end decadence that would be, in fact, very dark, right? There's sort of a transhumanist, post-human scenario that, as a Catholic, I would oppose, but under my definitions would count as an escape from decadence. So in that sense, it's not that all progress is good, but it is, I guess what I do think is that the society that we have built up is a society that expects and to some extent depends on the promise of progress. And it's very hard to imagine getting back to a society where that's not a big part of what is expected, hoped for, and so on. So I don't think, as much as I find a certain kind of pastoralist and agrarian perspective appealing in certain ways, I don't think there is a kind of pastoralist Wendell-Berryan retreat from the modern world. There is for some people in some communities, but not for the culture as a whole. So in that sense, I do think the alternatives are succeeding in finding new ways to grow or stagnating rather than finding Arcadia again.
Let me just ask two more questions before we turn to the audience for some of their comments and questions. So what are some, you entertain some alternatives. What is illiberal democracy an alternative here? I mean, is what's happening, arguably in Turkey or in Hungary or in Poland, I mean, is that a response to this? Is that a re-envisioning or re-enlivening of society, or is it something else?
Right. So my take is that both the revival of socialism, embodied by figures as diverse as the likely next Democratic nominee, pending events in tonight's debate, and Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn or others, and the kind of populist, nationalist, illiberal democracy mixture on the right are both responses to decadence, right? They're sort of summoned up as rebellions against stagnation. So Sanders and other socialists are basically saying, we took a wrong turn in the 60s and 70s, where we took a wrong turn with Reagan and Thatcher, and we can in fact get back to a more utopian perspective on what government can do. At the very least, the Scandinavian utopia, but maybe something beyond that. And then the populists and nationalists in various ways are saying, make America great again is in certain ways a futurist slogan, right? It's saying we were great in the past, we want to get back there in the future, and there's a future that we were promised that we haven't been given that we want to achieve again. And so in that sense, they are both kind of alternatives to the stewardship of decadence, right? I mean, Michael Bloomberg, Jeb Bush, to some extent Barack Obama, not maybe the Barack Obama of the 2008 campaign, but the Barack Obama who governed, Mitt Romney in 2012, were all sort of promising the same liberal or conservative politics and a kind of stewardship of a prosperous stagnation. And Sanders and Trump and Orban are all in different ways saying, no, we can do something different and we can do something better. That said, if in the book, I have some skepticism about how far this can go. I think, one, that once, as I said, once the populists take power, and I think the same would be true of the socialists, they are constrained by their own limitations and by the larger structural forces that make it hard to pursue dramatic change, even if you want to. That's one point. And then second, there are ways in which there's sort of a collaboration between a figure like Orban and people in the media who are terrified of what Orban represents, where he stands up and gives a speech and says, I represent an alternative to liberalism. And everyone in the Western press says, oh my God, he represents an alternative to liberalism. And in practice, Orbanism seems to want, the organization of the EU that, existed 20 years ago rather than today. It wants a kind of one-party or quasi-one-party situation for Hungary that, I think resembles Mexico across most of the 20th century or Japan at various points more than it represents, Mussolini's Italy. So it's sort of a democracy that is a real democracy but also has one clearly dominant party. And, his social conservatism is kind of the normal social conservatism of the post-1970s West. And, liberalism has obviously changed. And so sort of a standard conservatism can look more exotic in contrast with where progressives seem to be going. But I'm just not completely sure that in Orban you see a sort of return of history alternative so much as sort of a, slightly more conservative in ways I like, slightly more corrupt in ways I don't like, version of the existing late modern liberal democratic order. And I say in the book, if you crowned a king in Hungary, right? I mean, if you had these places reaching for a different source of legitimacy, right? Even Putin pretends to be a Democrat, small d. And maybe when in the Sanders campaign, large D, if they intervene. Sorry, Russian interference humor is not. But he, Putin. There are still elections in Russia. It's a quasi one-party state, but there are certain kinds of freedoms, and there's a lip service to democracy, even as Putin governs as kind of an autocrat. He's not crowning himself or having the Russian Orthodox Church crown him. He's not Tsar Vladimir. He's not restoring the Romanovs. It seems to me that you can't declare that we're in a really post-liberal world until you have powerful and important governments claiming some source of legitimacy that isn't just a version of, a version of the normal liberal democratic view. But I could be wrong. We'll see.
Someone may ask about it. So, final question for me at least. The book starts at the moon and ends with the stars.
Yep.
And you have this almost like sheepish, I'd be a bad Christian if I didn't mention faith, essentially, comment to begin the final chapter.
It's not sheepish. It's,
well, I mean, all of a sudden...
humble, modest, no.
So, I would be a bad Christian is humble. So, where... the book ends with hope, more or less, right? And the way in which faith can provide hope for people. Is that really the force of your argument, more or less, that really what's at the root of a decadent society is that it is a hopeless society? And
I think there's a go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I ask that in part because that would be a theme I would love to have seen carried out a little bit more, in the book. But maybe that's partly tactical, right? Because you're not writing simply for either a believing crowd or so on. But
I mean, I've written like 2 books about religion, and I figured I should dial it, become a little more sheepish. No, no, I think that
how to change the church. Right?
I think right. Yeah. I think that. I think yes. I think that, Barzoon, again, to go back to his definition, he says the loss the decadent society faces is that of possibility. And I think implicit in that is a sense that, like, the loss that it faces is a loss of confidence that, that this particular society is part of a story and has a particular destination. And that isn't exclusively a religious idea, but it is to some extent a religious idea. And in other books, I have made the argument that basically societies can't escape from having some sort of religious impulse or religious direction. I think that's true, certainly in this case. I think the more specific thing I want to claim, though, is that we should be cognizant, we as human beings, but particularly we as those of us who are religious believers and those of us who are specifically Catholic Christians should be cognizant, if we are in a story, this is a really interesting point in the story, right? So the story starts from a Christian perspective with an admonition to fill the earth, and subdue it. And for better or worse, with some, environmental catastrophes along the way and some further risks ahead, we've done that. And from a Christian perspective, the prior hinge moment of history came when there was not a true world empire, but what seemed like a world empire that had, similarly had a republican period and was entering an imperial period and was sort of exhausted seeming, and that was the moment when, God entered the world, right? And so if that was an interesting moment, then this moment of sort of world civilization is an equally interesting moment. And so what I draw from that is not just the idea that, okay, we need a recovery of faith and we need a religious revival. I obviously would be in favor of that, and that would be a sort of force pushing against decadence. But yeah, I go a little further and become a little more speculative and say, look, it's not, maybe it'll just be a Christian revival, but this is also a moment when we should expect something stranger to happen. And maybe that stranger thing is figuring out a way to sort of leap into the stars. And Peter Thiel, in his review of the book, said, well, Douthat really doesn't give enough space to the reasons why we probably can't build a warp drive. And that's fair, right? But I do think, right, we filled this one place, and we don't know if we can go further, but there is a huge universe out there, and maybe we are supposed to go further, or maybe this is a moment when it's not us going up, it's something unexpected coming down. And that's the strange place where I end the book, but I think it's a justified place. It really is the case that we have sort of reached some moment of human achievement that seems to have some limit on it. And if you believe that the human story has a purpose and a direction, then you would expect a really interesting plot twist to come along. Maybe not now, but somewhere in the next 200 years or so.
Sounds like a great place to turn to you guys. I'm going to stand up and approach the lectern because I can't see this side of the room, and I would never ask anybody over here to speak if I don't. Okay, so if you have questions, just raise your hand, and we will bring around a microphone. There's Vinny with one, and we have one over here, which I can barely see. Okay? Why don't we start it right up here? This is perfect.
You mentioned decadence and disaster, apocalypse, and so forth, and also the radicalization of politics with Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. My question is, where are we going? How is this going to end up? Are we living in first century Rome or in 1788 in Paris?
So my bet, and could be wrong, is that it's more first century Rome than late 18th century Paris, and that what you are seeing, and I was sort of gesturing at this, talking about Orban on the right, but I think the same applies to the left, is a desire to return to, you know, the bliss in that dawn to be alive spirit of the French Revolution, but a desire that's really hard to meet in a society that's rich and old and you know, stagnant and relatively stable. So my expectation is that, you know, you could put a socialist in the White House and the result would not be the French Revolution. It would be a sort of left-wing version of the struggles that the Trump administration has had to enact much of a legislative agenda. And in that sense, I don't, so I on the religious front, you know, I disagree a little bit with some of my religious conservative friends who see a sort of cultural progressivism carrying all before it and sort of reducing conservative Christians to little redoubts and rumps. I do think cultural progressivism has carried all before it in certain environments, but I think there are some limiting principles on its advance, and I think it's in certain ways more likely that, you know, the secularism of today is neither as vigorous nor as dangerous as the secularism that murdered nuns in the French Revolution. And the Christianity of today is neither as vigorous nor, from a secular perspective, as dangerous as you know, the Catholic reaction of the 19th century. And so we're sort of beating at each other with weak fists instead of action, and you know, reenacting the Vendée on Twitter, right? I mean, on that's happening online. I'm just not completely convinced that it's about to break out into dramatic revolutionary chaos in the real world. But probably there was someone in, you know, Nicholas and Alexandra's Russia who was saying the same thing right before Lenin arrived at the Finland station. So I do, you know, part of me expects to be guillotined with pages from this book stuffed into my mouth at some point in the next 20 years. He said we were too decadent. What did he know?
Yes, in the back, and then I'll get a couple of you guys over here.
Yeah, hey, Ross, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Walt Hudson from National Defense University, which is apropos. Senator Rubio spoke at this university, and he also spoke at my university a few months ago, and he's promoted, the term is common good capitalism. And the virtues of sclerotic decadenism notwithstanding,
right.
How does that fit in? I mean, is that a possible alternative that is proposed now that resists the excesses of the financialized thinking of the right and the redistributionist thinking of the left? I'd be curious for your thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, you know, full disclosure, I, you know, with some caveats, basically support some version of that kind of program, right? So to the extent that there's sort of an attempt by figures in different ways, like Senator Rubio and Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, to try and put a little more policy meat on the bones of Trumpian populism, I'm very interested in that, and I've been interested in that going back to books I wrote when I had more hair and was, you know, very, very young and innocent. And I do think the virtues of that kind of program is that, yeah, it's intended to push back against specific features of what I'm describing as decadence. And so, you know, it tends to contain within it efforts at pro-family policy that try and push back against the turn towards sterility and demographic decline. It includes in sort of, you know, in some versions, an emphasis on industrial policy and funding for research and technological innovation that tries to sort of get us back to, if not the Manhattan Project, at least the building of the interstate highway system or something like that. And so I think I think the promise of that kind of agenda too is that its goal is to build a real political majority and not just one of these 50+1 or 47+1 political coalitions that have exchanged power in our politics arguably since Reagan, certainly over the last 10 years, right? I mean, I think the clearest way out of political decadence, of sort of stalemate and gridlock in Washington, D.C., is for one of the two political parties to figure out, how do you build a majority that can win landslides? And I think Rubio's goal is to basically say, how do you take existing conservatism and make it more appealing to middle and working class Americans, and maybe especially in some cases Black and Latino Americans, to sort of build a kind of pan-ethnic conservative populism that's not just the kind of white working class conservatism that Donald Trump has managed to rally. So in all of those ways, I'm very favorably disposed towards Senator Rubio's project, and but it does, some of the caveats that I offered about populism and socialism both apply to that project too. That under conditions of decadence, it's very hard sometimes to make real headway, or maybe you're just pushing back a little, but it's hard to achieve that much. And so I try on the one hand to be optimistic and supportive of those efforts, but also at least somewhat realistic about their prospects. Because, I mean, in part, a lot of us who were involved in conservative policy work in the late 2000s and early 2010s had this idea that, we were sort of building a kind of incrementalist conservative reform agenda that someone like Rubio or Jeb Bush was going to embrace in 2016 and ride to victory. And instead, Trump came along and in certain ways adopted some of those ideas, but in a very different way, and blew everything up and destroyed a lot of my preconceptions about what can happen in American politics. And so that makes me, I would like to see a Republican Party led by Hawley and Rubio. I do think it's quite possible that the future of the Republican Party is an endless battle to the death between Don Jr. and Ivanka instead, and we should all be prepared for that eventuality.
But just real quick, to sum up the response, though, it is a no. That can't solve the decadence that you're describing here, right? The convergence of factors that you're describing, some of them are like outside of our control. You talked about limiting principles, right, on ingenuity and sort of what we can do that seem to be beyond our capacity to, form policies.
No, I'll be more optimistic than that. I think my basic assumption is that to really get us out of decadence, just, sort of the Rubio-esque approach is not sufficient, and you need some more disjunctive event, some sort of dramatic development that we aren't looking for, some innovation that that's even now being prepared but will sort of push radical change, some religious revival that can't be engineered from above. In that sense, the answer, is no. My expectation is decadence. It takes more than just political programs to end decadence, but it's not an either or, right? You can mitigate decadence. You can reduce decadence. The dot-com boom was temporary, but really did create a non-decadent window in the American economy. And what's the Eliot line, right? For us, there's only the trying. The rest is not our business. We should applaud the trying, and we shouldn't assume a limiting principle, like on human ingenuity, right? Yes, we do seem to have hit up against some kind of ceiling in how long we can extend human lives and how, what we can do with space travel and so on. But maybe it's not a ceiling. Maybe it's a bottleneck. Sometimes you're just sort of shouldering your way through, and then there's an unexpected range of innovations waiting on the other side. So it's not all pessimism.
All right, thank you. Good. We have a question right up here in the front. There we go.
So going back to the discussion of whether decadence is a Western or a global phenomenon, if you look at the world of 50 years ago, you have tremendous disparities between the Western world and the rest of the world in wealth. And then we have all of these barriers to transportation and communication and commerce coming down. And this is going to be kind of a pro-decadence question. Can the case be made that maintaining any level of minimal but positive growth in the Western world is actually a significant achievement, but politically nobody can say that?
Yes, that case can absolutely be made, and economists can say it. There is an author. It might be Dietrich Vollrath. I might be getting it wrong. Anyway, he has a suitably Germanic name, and he's written a book that's just coming out called Fully Grown, that basically makes the case that we should not expect, that economies really do develop to a certain point where it's unreasonable to expect them to achieve dramatic growth anymore, and they're as rich as we can get in our, to go to your point, we have resource constraints. We're a one-planet species at the moment. There's only so far we can go, and therefore our goal should be to get, our goal should just be convergence. We want to get India and China as close to the per capita GDP of the Western world as we can get. We want to, avoid the destruction of the coronavirus or anything else. And we want to be comfortable with the fact that at the current frontier of human prosperity, the best you can do is what we've done since the Great Recession. 2% growth that compounds over time, and requires some pretty big deficits to sustain. But we're rich; we can maintain those deficits, and that's a great achievement. And that is literally the case for sustainable decadence. And I think it is worth taking I try and take it seriously in the book. The book is not just decadence is the worst thing in the world. No, if it really is the case that there is certain technological ceilings that we're hitting, and that we're not going to invent the warp drive and so on, then we shouldn't be totally unhappy with that kind of scenario. That being said, I think one, there's a tendency for that council of reasonability to become a kind of council of quasi-despair, right? Where at a certain point you're like, this was all we could ever do, and we just have to accept these limits on our imagination, which sort of puts some of the best of humanity increasingly to one side. And then there's also the aspect of decadence that, we've talked about a little less, but where the sort of, the Huxleyan Brave New World scenario, right, is under those conditions a real peril, right? Where you don't have, the gulag, but you have sort of slow motion dehumanization, where people, their horizons are narrow. They're just sort of, you're going to have small families because you don't want to have too big a carbon footprint, and you don't have wide kinship networks, and you retreat into virtual realities and simulacra, and the next thing you know, you're on Soma and watching the Feelies, and Mustafa Mond is in charge, and it is, you're right, it's Huxley territory, and that I think is why, and I don't think we're there, but I think there are elements in our society. We have drugs that are sort of Soma-ish. We have an awful lot of online pornography as a substitute for real life romance, sex, and marriage. And you want, the part of me that's not content with the case for sustainable decadence basically looks at that and says, if you don't have people pushing against decadence, whether it's politicians looking for an agenda or just people trying to be fertile and creative in their own communities and lives, then you can drift a long way towards the Brave New World endpoint without anyone completely noticing. And you wake up one day and, you're hooked up. I'm not going to be able to quote Huxley sufficiently, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, right here in the back. No, the fellow behind you. I think his hand was up earlier. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I was wondering, Russ, if you could connect the themes of your last two books for us. How does this decadence analysis apply to the Catholic Church today, and what should the Catholic Church's response to the present decadent status quo look like? Thanks.
Sure. So I think you can see this argument. So my last book, for those of you who missed it, was an analysis, a sort of analysis of the controversies in the church in the first 4 or 5 years of the Francis pontificate, with me taking the more conservative side and ending up, fairly critical in certain cases of the Holy Father, but also arguing that some of the changes that he or people around him were pushing for were a really dramatic moment in Catholic history with the potential to create schisms down the road. And I think you could see this book as a kind of qualifier to that analysis, that to the extent that I think the evidence of the 2.5 years since I wrote my book is that decadence in Catholicism itself is more powerful than maybe I thought when I was writing the book. And again, as a conservative who was doubtful of some of the reforms being considered in Rome, I'm rooting for decadence in the sense that I'm sort of rooting for a return to the liberal conservative stalemate rather than a sweeping liberalization and sweeping transformation. But that is, I think, sort of the story of the last couple years, pending events in Germany, that, you know, that if not Francis himself, certainly figures around him had a pretty dramatic reform agenda that was sort of stalled in the synods, but sort of pushed forward to some extent through Amoris Laetitia and its famous footnote. But then beyond that, whether it's homosexuality and same-sex blessings, or, you know, in the case of the last year or so, deaconesses and especially celibacy in the priesthood, the push has continued, and then each time the Holy Father has backed off, and we've sort of returned to a version of the status quo ante. So I think that suggests that, yeah, I think the Catholic Church in the Western world is very clearly decadent in various ways in terms of being sort of a large institution struggling to adapt and in some kind of slow motion decline, and decadence rather than crack up seems like where even the Francis pontificate has ended up. As to what the Church should and can be doing, I mean, I think it's a really tricky question for the hierarchy, for people. I mean, it's the problem of a bishop or an archbishop supervising the church, supervising a city or a region from on high is similar to the problems of politicians in Washington under conditions of decadence, that, you know, if you throw yourself into revolution or dramatic transformation, it may fail or it may actually make things worse, and so there's, you know, an understandable desire to sort of steward the ship as it exists for as long as it exists. But that in turn, I think, makes it that much more important for Catholic institutions and figures who have the capacity to be more nimble and adaptable, to think more about what renewal from within looks like. And you can even take, you know, the Roman case study with, you know, the Roman Catholic Church as Rome and forces of Catholic renewal as the Christians within this sort of imperial context. And it's obviously not, you know, not quite like that in the sense that, in spite of what some Twitter accounts occasionally argue, the Vatican is not necessarily going to persecute would-be reformers as, you know, Nero persecuted Christians. But there is still a sense in which, yeah, you're trying to sort of breathe life into an institution from within, and that means figuring out, you know, to take it. I'll just give you one American example context. What does the American church need right now? It needs a lot of things, but let's say maybe it needs a missionary order, a new or revived existing order, capable of essentially treating significant portions of once Catholic America as mission territory, right? And that's something that, you know, again, as a newspaper columnist who writes about the church, I'm not in a position to invent or found, but there are people who are in a position potentially to do that. And, you know, the world of sort of decaying Catholic dioceses maybe needs an order where, you know, you have 3 priests coming in and living in an oratory and handling 7 parishes between them in, you know, as the diocese itself fails to generate vocations. That's just one, obviously just one example, but that's the kind of sort of, you're not trying to save the whole tottering structure, but you're trying to figure out ways also not to abandon the structure and to find sort of dynamic ways to renew it even amid its decay.
So maybe 2 more questions. Maybe Professor Gorman up front, and then the fellow who I almost called on before.
I'm wondering if you'd be interested in commenting on the topic of risk. I'm old enough to remember that we just wandered around the neighborhood. Our parents didn't know where we were, and we didn't wear helmets when we rode bicycles, except when we thought it made us look cool. And now I feel like, so I mean, that's just meant to be a little tiny metaphor. I wonder if our society is just extremely risk averse.
Yes. No, I don't think that's a tiny metaphor at all. I think that actually gets to one of the core questions here, right? Which is it's not just bicycle helmets. Teenage life in America is safer than it's ever been, in spite of, fears of predators on the streets and pedophiles on the internet. If you look at teen behavior, if you look at drinking and driving and, most drug use, not completely marijuana, but almost every other form of drug use, teen pregnancy, how early kids have sex, all of the substance of 1,000 rock and roll songs, everything is safer than it was when I was a kid, and even safer, I'm assuming we're about 2 years apart in age than when you were a kid. And literally people had this argument on Twitter just the other day. David French, who was circulated a version of this chart and said, well, the only thing that kids are doing more of is playing Call of Duty, and David French, as a good Frenchist, is in favor of Call of Duty. But in fact, to see it would all, you knew it would come back to Amari French in the end. There's something about the spirit of this place. But I don't think that's, I don't think that's a sufficient analysis. It's not just that the kids are playing more video games. It's also that they are somewhat more depressed and anxious, and teen suicide rates have gone up steeply, even as all of these other indicators have improved. And then beyond that, there's, we'll see how things look in 10 years, but right now it seems like these anxious, iPhone-using, video game-playing teens then have more trouble than past generations forming meaningful relationships, figuring out, how to pair off and get married and have kids. And that seems to me to be the crucial sort of decadence trade-off right now at this moment, that we have more safety and stability in many ways than America had in 1969. And that's sort of what conservatives wanted, right? Conservatives looked at the 60s and 70s and said, well, there's been this terrible collapse. The dynamism of the baby boom generation was a destructive dynamism, and so we need a recovery of stability. But the recovery of stability we got can feel more like a sickness unto death than a real return of fruitfulness. So things are, they're not, the Tarantino movie, right, that came out this year, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, is sort of a portrait of a moment in time that in many ways cultural conservatives sort of deplore, this moment of sort of, the sexual revolution reaching its peak, and then the moment where the Manson family shows up and people are murdered and the dark 70s begin. But it's striking to watch that movie, and of course it's a fantasy, but it's a fantasy with roots in reality, to see sort of just how young and garish and vigorous and vibrant the America that Tarantino conjures up seems to be. And it was, and part of the theme of this book is a sort of, in a sense, I'm a cultural conservative who is in certain ways nostalgic for a certain degree of chaos, and, finds myself, to my own surprise, preferring it to a stability that doesn't seem to have real fruitfulness about it.
Great. Final question?
Thank you, and thank you for a really interesting conversation. You've referred to a number of artworks over the course of the night, or cultural products, and I'm kind of curious about, or to ask you to reflect on the relationship between the arts and this sort of decadent moment. And if I could preempt sort of maybe the most obvious answer, I was thinking about the decadent movement in the arts and the way that it arises actually in a very confident and arguably overconfident late Victorian moment, and sees itself as a kind of rejection or critique of a kind of banal confidence in progress. So if I'm right, if there is not a one-to-one correlation between a decadent culture and decadent arts, what kind of art might we expect, hope for, or dread arising in a decadent culture?
Yeah, so, I would, under my definition, and this is an eccentric claim to make, the decadents weren't really decadent, right? In the sense that they were sort of overripe and highly aestheticized and, and sort of experimenting. Again, I mean, like the sort of 69 moment in American culture, sort of experimenting with transgression for its own sake. But they had a sort of, you know, they felt like they were sort of, in effect, renewing a kind of, you know, increasingly sterile, bourgeois, smug, late Victorian moment. And I don't think you really have that in the arts today. I feel like the sort of transgressiveness that conservatives deplore has sort of reached its endpoint and given way to a kind of, you know, a sort of early adolescent culture. I mean, this is my impression of sort of certainly where a lot of cinema has ended up, sort of mass market cinema, is in a space that is perpetually 14 years old. No, not childish, leaving childhood behind, sort of, but it's all the superhero origin story that never ends, right? Where you're always just sort of coming into your powers and have a lot of adolescent angst about it, but never move on to adulthood. There's no, you know, there's no sex or sort of, you know, real romance in the superhero universe. It's always sort of that sort of scary adulthood, and you never quite get there. And in the same way, I mean, I think the sort of, in what's distinctive in the higher arts about this era is their retreat from cultural significance, mostly, right? I mean, I don't think I don't feel that I am well versed enough in the state of contemporary painting or opera. I haven't gone to see Akhenaten. You know, I don't feel like I'm completely equipped to comment on the aesthetic quality of some of certain areas of the high arts, but I am equipped as sort of a cultural observer to say their place in society has shrunk dramatically, and what has taken their place, even for the very well-educated, the people who were, you know, in an earlier era would have been going to the opera and sort of sustaining art galleries and so on, is a sort of algorithmically generated entertainment content that is, you know, it's pretty good. Every Netflix show is pretty good, but it's not. It's, you know, it is in its own way stuck in ruts and doing the same thing over and over again. And so I see like the moment of the golden age of TV, sort of the way I see the internet boom, right? There was this brief moment where a bunch of auteurish figures were able to create some, you know, really impressive works of art on television, and that lasted about 10 years, and it sort of echoed the auteur-driven cinema of the 70s. But now, you know, that was nice, but now it's over, and now just the algorithm is creating our television entertainment. So that's, the parts of the book that are about culture are mostly about that, about the ways that we're in a sort of, we're in a period of sort of repetition and uncreativity, and also a period where something like the internet has not had exactly the effect that people expected, that it's actually sort of homogenized things further, right? The promise of the internet, which I am now old enough to look back on, right, as a nostalgic thing, was that, you know, instead of big newspapers, you were going to have bloggers, and instead of huge pop stars, you were going to have 1 million people playing the guitar, and some of that exists in the way that teens use, you know, TikTok and YouTube and these kind of things. That doesn't completely not exist, but in fact, in terms of like cultural production, the internet has been a consolidating force. It destroyed small and mid-sized newspapers, so now you have a few big newspapers like mine that are doing pretty well, but the small and mid-sized ones are weaker or gone. And it, you know, weakened small or mid-sized recording artists. So Taylor Swift and Kanye are bigger than ever, but the sort of more eccentric figures have less commercial viability. And the same thing in publishing. You know, it's sort of, it's pushed in different ways everything towards a sort of Marvelization of culture. And I enjoy Marvel movies, but they do seem to represent a kind of a version of the repetition that I'm talking about in the book.
Great, thank you. The book is fantastic. It really is worth reading. It's an easy read. Ross's style, it is. I mean, Ross's style is very accessible, and it's funny. I don't mean it's unsophisticated, Ross. It's easy and sophisticated.
The goal is to write the Dan Brown page turner. So if that's how it plays, that's excellent.
Well, great. I'm glad to hear that you have goals in your life, and apparently the rest of us don't. We inhabit in a decadent society. Anyway, thank you all, of course, for coming out, like I said, on a Tuesday night to be with us. And we're really grateful that Ross joined us tonight on the day that his book is released. It's really a privilege to have you here with us. There's a reception afterwards. I think you're able to stay around and answer more questions.
The debate doesn't start till 8 p.m., so I have
Excellent, excellent. Again, let's join me in thanking Ross.
Thank you.